Tonight we are continuing our study of things that bring heartaches and suffering to us in the realm of mental and emotional matters. And we were talking about worry as we completed our class last week. Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, the late Norman Vincent Peale, said, "America has become so tense and nervous, it has been years since I saw anyone asleep in church." He hasn't been attending our services, has he? We can still do it. We're not that tense and nervous, and I have a little different attitude toward sleeping in worship now than I did back when I was in the pulpit. I see things from a little different viewpoint now, and I understand that people can be so sick they can't sleep the night before, and then when they come to Bible study and worship, it is very difficult for them to stay awake. That's just a physical thing, but I understand it. I do understand that sometimes we do go to sleep in services. I heard about a man who would go to sleep in worship, and he'd lean back with his mouth open and snore loudly. And on one occasion, someone dropped a quinine tablet in his mouth. If you know anything about those, you know how bitter they are. He began to taste that thing and jumped up and down in the aisle and said, "Somebody pray for me, my gallbladder's busted." Things like that can happen, all right. But I appreciate the fact that people are willing to come together to worship, even when they're taking medicine and other things that might be difficult for them to stay awake. We pointed out the fact that if we're going to deal with this matter of worship, and it's a common thing all over America with many, many people, we need to first of all analyze it, look at the situation and determine why we're worrying, and if it is something that can change, then don't worry about it. Change it. If it is something that can't be changed, don't worry about it. Just go ahead with life and don't worry about it. And so we need to analyze the thing and see why we're worrying. And that can help us perhaps to make a decision about what to do about it. And the second thing we mentioned was pray about it. Christians have the right of prayer. In Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul said, "Be careful for nothing." And as we mentioned, that's the King James rendering. The American Standard Version says, "In nothing be anxious, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God." And so we may pray about everything. There is nothing that lies beyond the power of prayer except that which lies beyond the will of God. If it's within God's will, we can pray about the matter. What will be the result of prayer? In verse 7 he said, "And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." And so we can pray about these matters. If we have worries, things that are really bothering us, causing us suffering, we need to pray about that matter. Ask God to help us with it. And then the third thing, which is where we're to begin tonight, is to take action, appropriate action. We need to take the action that will help us overcome that particular thing. As we have said, if it's something that can be changed, we can work on changing it. If it can't be changed, we can work on accepting it and living with it. And so that's suggestion number 4. After you take action, and after you've prayed about it, and if it's still there, still bothering you, then you need to learn to live with it or accept it. Paul faced that matter in regard to that thorn in the flesh. We've mentioned this several times. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 9, he talked about that thorn in the flesh, and he asked God 3 times to remove it, but God said no each time. And in verse 7 of 2 Corinthians 12, Paul said, "And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." So Paul was willing to accept it and live with it with the grace of God. And he knew that when he was depending upon God, he's stronger. Stronger because God was working with him and blessing him. And so there may come a time when we might just need to accept whatever that thing is that's causing us heartaches and sorrows. There are some things that we can't change, can't do anything about them. We just have to learn to accept them. You have to concentrate on what you have left and not on what you don't have anymore. Remember the case of Helen Keller? She lost her hearing and sight when she was 19 months old. And later, with the right person teaching her, she learned to live with it and to deal with what she had or work with what she had left. And she became a great person. We may have to do that in regard to our worries. Do everything we can, pray to God about it, and when nothing can be done about it, we need to learn to accept it. I had a friend down in Wildwood, Florida, who had a bad case of diabetes. And the time came when the doctors had to remove his left foot and part of his leg. And he came through that all right, and just after the surgery I was visiting with him, and he was awake by that time. He said, I want to do something. I want to give you something. I want to give you that foot and leg, and you can use it as a soup bone. Now, that didn't sound too appetizing to me, so I declined the invitation to accept it. And then I don't know how many people he told that to. He said, you can have this foot and the leg, and you can use it as a soup bone. That was his way of dealing with that thing. He never worried about not having that foot and leg anymore. I never saw him worrying about it until he died, and I conducted his funeral. He lived with that situation. Maybe that's what we need to do about some things that have caused us to worry. We may have to come to accept them, just live with them. Now, his way of dealing with it was to make a joke of the fact that he had lost that foot and leg. And so we need to learn to accept some things when nothing can be done about it. And then number 5, get involved in service to others. Much of the worry that we have is caused by looking at self, our needs, and our problems. But suppose we turn our focus to others and we begin to help them and serve them. I think I can give you a money-back guarantee on this one. If you become involved in serving other people, it will take much of your attention off of yourself. If you're hurting in some way, think of somebody else who may be hurting in the same way and go to help them. Talk to them. Spend some time with them. Do things for them. The point is, if we turn our attention to other people in service, it'll help us with our particular problems. So we need to learn to serve others. Matthew 25, verse 14 and following, Jesus teaches that we're to serve other people. And in the latter part of the chapter, he teaches that's the basis upon which judgment will be made. How we served other people. That's how we serve Christ. So, number 5, get involved in service to others. And then, number 6, trust God. In all of these ways in which we suffer, physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, the real answer to it is to trust God. I've used Romans 8:28 a number of times in this series, and I believe it's the real key. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. If we can believe that passage and trust in God, no matter what happens to us, God is able to take it and make it work together for our good. That's a good passage to write down in your memory. Put it into your memory. And when you face some difficulty in life, no matter what it is, believe that God is able to take it and make it work together for your good. And another thing to remember on that is the teaching of Christ in Matthew chapter 6. In the Sermon on the Mount, he dealt with this matter of worrying about this and that. In verse 25, he said, "Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment?" Jesus is saying God gives you these greater blessings of life and your body. Don't you think He's going to give you the lesser blessings of food for the body and clothing for the body? You don't need to worry about it. You know, God is like these great pillars underneath a bridge. You've gone across some of these bridges that span a great body of water. As you're traveling across that bridge, you can't see those pillars underneath. Down underneath that bridge are those great pillars that go down under the water and stand upon a firm foundation. Now you trust those pillars when you cross that bridge. Why don't we trust God? He is like those pillars that undergird the bridge. God undergirds our lives. He stands beneath us and holds us up. And He makes everything work together for our good. And so Jesus teaches that it is unnecessary for us to worry about these things we need in life. God is aware of them. In verse 26, He said, "Behold the fowls of the air. They sow not, neither do they reap. And yet your heavenly Father feedeth them." They don't gather into barns, He said. They don't sow, they don't reap, but God takes care of them. If God takes care of the birds that are almost worthless, surely He'll take care of you. You're made in the image of God. You're His child if you're a Christian. God loves you. He's aware of your needs. It's unnecessary to worry about those things because God is aware of our needs and He provides for them. In the second place, he said worry is unproductive. In verse 27, He said, "Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature?" Now, a cubit is about 18 inches from the elbow to the end of the finger, as David pointed out in his Sunday morning lesson a few weeks ago. It's amazing how close to 18 inches mine is. I've measured it, about 18 inches, a cubit. Now, you can't grow a cubit by worrying about it and wanting to be taller. Now, all my life, I've wanted to be taller. I haven't worried about it because I know it wouldn't do any good. And my feet reach the ground. That's the most important part anyway. So I don't worry about it. But I'd like to be taller. But I can't do it by worrying about it or thinking about it or wanting to do it. Jesus says worrying won't do any good. Worrying is about like rocking in a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. Sit down in that rocking chair at home in the morning and check it out. Rock all day long. And at the end of the day, observe where you are. In the same place. Doesn't do any good. Jesus is teaching worry is like that. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't help. And then in the third place, He says worry is unbecoming for the Christian. Now, notice verse 32. He said, "For after all these things do the Gentiles seek." Now, the Gentiles refers to people who are not God's people. You can expect those people to worry about those things. But God's people shouldn't have to worry about them. God's people are going to be cared for. God's going to provide for them. There was a little poem I read somewhere. Said the robin to the sparrow, "I would really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so." Said the sparrow to the robin, "Friend, I think it must be that they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me." We can learn something from the birds. They don't worry about what they're going to eat. God's going to take care of them. And God will take care of us. And Jesus is saying worry is unbecoming for the Christian. It's not something that ought to be found in Christians. You can find that among those who are not Christians. But among God's people, it is unbecoming. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus and the apostles were crossing over the sea, and at night, Jesus was taking a nap, and the storm came up. I mean, a big storm began to brew and began to toss them about, and waves were high. And Jesus was asleep. And the apostles came to him and awakened him and said, "Master, carest thou not that we perish?" You see, they were worrying themselves sick, concerned about it. And then Jesus said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" You see, fear is the lack of faith. They were afraid and worrying about themselves because they didn't have faith. Now, there is a place for anxiety in our lives if we're in a storm and Jesus is not in our boat. Now, if Jesus is not in our boat, if He's not with us, then you can be anxious, concerned about it. But if Jesus is in our boat, if we are Christians and we are in the Lord, then we don't have to worry about things. He's going to make things work out right. Now, you may be thrown overboard and things may happen, but God is going to make everything work together for our good. And so we need to understand that there are some things that we worry about that we don't need to be worried about. In fact, what's his name? Will Rogers, the late comedian, said, "I figure there is no use in being too particular. I don't care which side my bread is buttered on. I always eat both sides anyway." There are some things that we don't need to be worrying about. And concerning those things that are of concern and that are matters that are dangerous to us and can bring heartache and suffering to us, there are some steps we can take. We need to analyze it, see what we can do it. We need to pray about it, and we need to get involved in service to other people, and it'll take some of the attention away from our worries. And then we need to trust God. That's the main thing we need to do. Well, I want to skip the next point and go to grief, because I don't want to get halfway through this lesson on grief tonight and then have to quit until the next week. So let's go to grief, and I'll come back to fear a little later. When you go to the store to buy clothing, you can buy clothing of all sizes. You can get them small, medium, or large, or extra large, or whatever. But you know, grief doesn't come like that. Grief comes in one size. Extra large is something that's terrible and bad and brings us a great deal of suffering. And grief is a very normal thing. And if we handle it properly, we can get through it. But it's a very difficult thing, and I would not minimize the importance of it at all. I understand that the word grief comes from a Hebrew word that means the same thing as piercing one through with a sword. You remember in Luke chapter 2, about verse 35, when Mary and Joseph went to the temple to worship, Simeon the prophet told Mary, "A sword shall pierce thy soul." We sometimes say, "pierce thy heart." Maybe some translations use that word heart. But the idea that's involved in that sword piercing the soul or the heart is the idea involved in suffering. I understand the word grief comes from a Hebrew word that means the same thing as being pierced through the heart. There are 10 steps to overcoming grief that I like to share with you tonight. Now, I want to tell you that these are words from a man with a PhD in counseling and psychology, Brother Bill Flatt. He was a teacher at Harding Graduate School, a gospel preacher, a teacher in the school there on psychology and grief and so on. He's written several books. He knows what he's talking about. He knows far more about grief and how to deal with it than I do. I've had some experience in over 50 years of preaching and helping people with grief. But here's a man who is well qualified from an academic standpoint and from a biblical standpoint. And I concur with these things, and I want to suggest to you 10 things that he suggested that can be helpful to us in overcoming grief. Now, grief can come to us in various ways, of course. It can come when we lose loved ones in death. It can come with a very serious illness. We can grieve during the period of time in which we're wrestling with it. Grief can come to us when our children are wayward. And one of the greatest heartaches and sorrows that people can endure is to have children who are not serving God. And we want to deal with that in a separate lesson here. I want to present a lesson on how to help parents who are grieving, help for hurting parents. But remember, there are various ways in which people can suffer grief. And the first thing that we'd like to suggest is learn certain facts about grief. There are certain things that can be helpful to us if we understand them in the beginning. First of all, there are 3 stages of grief. Now, if you study from different people who have studied psychology, they may differ in the number of things they say that are involved in it. Dr. Bill Flatt says there are 3. Number 1 is shock. First of all, when something happens like the death of a loved one, you are shocked to the core. You're not expecting it. It just happens, and it cuts you to the heart. You remember that Job went through the same thing when the devil attacked him. lost all of his animals. Over 3,000 animals were lost, stolen. And then his servants were killed. And then his 10 children were killed all at one time in a cyclone. And then Job himself was afflicted with boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. And Job was in shock. There's a passage in which he says, "Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not." If anybody knows the truthfulness of that, it was Job. He suffered greatly. And so there's a period of shock in the beginning. And second, there's a period of suffering. When you recognize the fact that this person is gone and is not coming back, and you suffer without that loved one with you. In a number of ways, you miss that person. And so there's a period of suffering in which you really understand what grief is all about. And then number 3, there is recovery. There comes a period of time in which you begin to recover from this loss of the loved one. There may be many strange experiences that happen to you during that time, and you may think you're losing your mind. One lady who lost her husband was going through this period, and she went to the store and stocked up on a number of things she needed, came back home and started putting things up. And then later she realized that she had put the toilet paper into the refrigerator. That's not the normal place where you would put it. And sometimes things like that may happen, and a person may think he's going crazy. But that's not necessarily true. Sometimes we do things like that when we're not even grieving. You see, I've known of that to happen. Some things like that just happen because you're distracted. You're thinking about that loved one who has gone and is no longer with you, and you don't realize what you're doing sometimes. But you get over that after a while. Understanding that these experiences can occur and are considered to be normal can help you overcome that grief. If you realize that it's a normal thing to go through things like that, it'll help you to deal with it and get over it. There's a difference, however, between normal grief and abnormal grief. There are some things that are just normal, and you're going to cry, and you're going to miss that person, and you're going to suffer because that person is no longer with you. But then there are some things that are abnormal. There was a lady whose husband had died, and she was suffering greatly, and she decided that she didn't need to grieve anymore, and so she decided not to go to her husband's funeral. Rather, she decided to take a fun-filled vacation to Florida. So she went to Florida instead of going to the funeral. 6 months later, she had a nervous breakdown because she did not grieve. She didn't express her grief, you see. And so during this period of time, we will need to recognize the fact that we're going to grieve, we need to grieve, and we need to take things normally and not do something abnormal like not going to one's husband's funeral. So number 1, learn some facts about grief. And then number 2, admit the loss. When you lose a loved one, you have to recognize that fact that he is dead or she is dead and she's not coming back. Sometimes people don't admit that the one has died, and they assume he's just away, he's gone somewhere and he'll be back, and they just don't accept the fact that that loved one is gone. So first of all, or secondly, one must admit the fact that that person is dead. And number 3, talk it out. Old memories will not be forgotten, and they should not be. And one needs to go back and remember all those good things. Remember those good memories. Sometimes when we go to visit with someone who has lost a loved one, we're afraid to mention the person who's died. You know, we go in and talk about everything else, and we never mention the person who has died. That person needs to talk about that one who has died. And it would be good if we bring up some good memories. It will help that person to settle down and accept the fact that that one is gone. And so we need to admit the loss, talk it out. There are several things that need to be considered in that. Sometimes a grieving person is angry. He's angry with the person who's died. Have you known of someone who said, as if to the husband, "Why did you die and leave me like this?" I've known of some cases like that in which the person became angry with the one who had died. Sometimes they become angry with the preacher. I've known that to happen. Sometimes they think the preacher didn't do what he should have done. He wasn't there at the right time or often enough. They become angry at the preacher. And that's all a part of this period of time in which they are suffering. And we need to try to talk it out and get rid of those angry feelings. Sometimes a person is angry with self. The one who is left sometimes is angry because he or she feels that she didn't do everything for that person and might have been able to prevent his death. But of course, that's usually not true. We also need to talk it out if we have some guilt feelings. Sometimes the person who's left has guilt feelings, and they feel that they didn't do everything they could to save that person. There was a lady whose husband died, and just before he died, she had sent him to the store to pick up some things, and while he was at the store, he had a heart attack and died. And she blamed herself, and she felt guilty, and she said, "If I had not sent him to the store, he wouldn't have died." Well, that's probably not true. He had a heart condition, and he probably would have died if he had been at home lying on the couch or if he'd been washing the dishes. And so she should not have felt guilty because her husband died when she sent him to the store. Now, the guilt feelings that sometimes come to people are false guilt feelings. We sometimes feel guilty when we ought not to, and we need to talk it out and get rid of those feelings. A lady may say after her husband dies, "If I'd taken him to the doctor earlier, then he would not have died." Well, that's not necessarily true. And guilt feelings sometimes can eat us up when we really don't need to have those feelings. And there's a special case in which some people can really suffer. If one commits suicide, then the other one really feels guilty and thinks, if I'd done this or if I'd not done that, then he would not have killed himself. And then sometimes people are guilty, and that's when they really suffer. Let me tell you about a case. There was a young man who was married. He and his wife had a little girl. But then he learned that his wife was being unfaithful to him. He went to the hardware store and bought a water hose, and drove out into an orange grove. And he got back in the grove where people wouldn't see his car just by driving by. He put one end of that hose into the exhaust pipe and the other end into the window of the car and rolled the window up as far as it could go. He got in the car and cranked it and sat there in that car with that carbon monoxide poisoning coming into the car. And he sat there until the gas ran out. And then sometime later, when he was found, he had been sitting in that car and he got up to 130, 140 degrees in that hot Florida sun. And he was so bloated you couldn't even recognize him. I attended the funeral, and I heard that wife crying and screaming and yelling, completely out of her mind. But I felt that it was guilt feelings. She was doing that because she knew he had killed himself because she had been unfaithful to him. She was carrying real guilt. Now there comes a time when we might need to see a professional counselor, someone who is well trained and might be able to help us with it. But in many cases, we could talk to a preacher, and we could talk to an elder, or even a friend who will listen, and we need to talk it out. Number 4, express your grief. In America today, we teach our children they ought not to cry, don't we? Little boys get hurt, and we say, big boys don't cry, and we try to keep them from crying. A little girl can get hurt, and we try to keep her from crying. We tell her, don't cry. And yet they need to. When they become grown, if they have had it ingrained in their minds that they shouldn't cry, when some loved one dies, it may be difficult for them to express their grief. And we need to be able to do that, express our grief. God created tear ducts. There must be a use for them. God put them within us. And we need to be able to use them. We need to be able to cry. Jesus did, didn't he? John 11:35, Jesus wept. And it's all right for us to cry. It is good for us to express our grief. It's like a safety valve. Did you ever see your mother when she canned food, vegetables? She put it in this pot and closed it, and then the steam inside would escape. If it didn't, that thing would explode. And the same thing can happen to us. If one fails to grieve and he bottles up all these feelings inside, he's storing up a great deal of trouble. Difficulty may blow up after a while. We need to learn to express our grief. Number 5, force yourself into circulation. It'd be good to go back and visit with people. Of course, attend the services of the church faithfully and regularly. Interact with people. Here in this area, there is a group that meets together, I think, monthly. Widows and widowers and single people. They get together and eat together, and it helps them. And in some cases, they find another mate that way. I can tell you about someone you know who found another wife that way, another husband. And I can tell you about a 90-year-old preacher in this area who attends that group, and he's found a friend. And there are others who have found someone with whom to associate. And we need to be able to get together with other people and get back into circulation if we're going to get over this matter. Number 6, learn to adjust to a new identity. When one dies, the one who's left sometimes has a little trouble identifying himself or herself. If he dies, she wonders, now am I married or am I not? Is it all right later if I want to begin dating again? Or would I be unfaithful to my husband? Those are things that one will have to wrestle with, and he might need to talk to someone who might help him to understand some things in that regard. But learn to adjust to a new identity. And then, number 7, do something about your depression. Now, it's possible that we will become depressed after a loved one dies. We're frustrated, and we're down at the bottom, and we might become depressed. We need to do something about that depression. A depressed person can force himself out of that depression. He can determine he's going to do certain things and begin to do them. Make a list of things that you like to do before and that you like to do now, and then check them off as you do them. Get involved again, and that'll help you to get over that depression. And I put a scripture down on number 7, 1 Kings chapter 5. We erased that on this thing. But read 1 Kings 17, 18, and actually through 19, and read about Elijah when he became depressed and how he overcame it. That'll be good reading for you. Then number 8, serve others. Get involved in serving other people, and it'll help you to get over your grief and sorrow that you're experiencing. Pick out someone else who's suffered the same thing you have. Bake some cookies or a cake and take it to that person. Go over to do something for that person. A man who has lost his wife might go over to another man who has had the same experience and help him, talk to him, visit with him, cut his grass for him. Then number 9, set your sail in the direction in which you want to go in life. I've been amazed at sailboats. You wonder how in the world those things can go toward the wind. Wind's blowing in this direction, the sailboat can really go that way. It depends upon the set of the sail. And that suggests it depends upon your attitude. You can set your attitude to how you want to be and what you're going to do the rest of your life, and you can do it. And number 10 is one I was really trying to get to. Lean on God. You will observe in all of these areas that we've been talking about, I've tried to emphasize the fact that we need to lean on God. Turn to God, and He will help us. There are many scriptures that teach that. For example, in Psalm 55, verse 22, cast thy burdens upon the Lord, and He shall sustain you. There are passages that suggest that we have responsibilities ourselves. In Galatians 6 and verse 5, for every man shall bear his own burdens. Verse 2 tells us there are burdens that others can help us bear. Bear you one another's burdens. But then remember mainly that passage in chapter 55 of Psalm, verse 22, cast thy burdens upon the Lord. Many passages tell us that God loves us, He'll take care of us, and He will bless us. Now, I really wanted to get to something else here. Let's turn it to that song, please. Be with me, Lord. Notice the words of this song. I cannot live without Thee. I dare not try to take one step alone. I cannot bear the loads of life unaided. I need Thy strength to lean myself upon. Be with me, Lord, and then if dangers threaten, if storms of trial burst above my head, if lashing seas leap everywhere about me, they cannot harm or make my heart afraid. Be with me, Lord, no other gift or blessing Thou couldst bestow could with this one compare. A constant sense of Thy abiding presence, whate'er I am, to feel that Thou art near. Be with me, Lord, when loneliness o'ertakes me, when I must weep amid the fires of pain, and when shall come the hour of my departure for worlds unknown, O Lord, be with me then. If you read those words and think about them, they ought to help you. They'll sustain you. You'll notice, well, it's not shown right there, but L.O. Sanderson is given the credit for that song. It is said that that is his most famous song. But did you know that Brother Sanderson didn't write those words to that song? When I was preaching in Atlanta, Brother L.O. Sanderson came to work with us as my assistant preacher, and I came to know him well and learned a lot of things about him. And this song has been said to be his most famous song, most popular song, but he told me how that thing came about. He was a gospel preacher as well. He used to be the music director for the Gospel Advocate since 1933, and he was the editor of Christian hymns numbers 1, 2, and 3, and he wrote about 300 songs. He was preaching up in Springfield, Missouri, I believe it was, and he was working on a sermon one night, late at night, 11, 12 o'clock. He was trying to put his thoughts together for a sermon, but a tune kept coming into his mind. He'd never heard it before. He'd never sung a song with that tune before. He was a musician, a composer, and this tune kept coming into his mind. He couldn't concentrate on his sermon. He said he finally just laid it aside and began to put that music down that he'd been thinking. He put it on paper, the melody and then the other parts, and he had written the whole thing, all the music. And then he laid it aside and went back to his sermon. About a week later, he received a letter from T.O. Chisholm, who was living in New Jersey at that time. He was not a member of the church, but he would write poems and send them to Brother Sanderson for him to write music to go with them. He sent a letter to him and sent him a poem. And he said, I wrote that a few nights ago when I couldn't sleep. And the night he couldn't sleep was the very night Brother Sanderson wrote the music to this song. And he sent that poem to Brother Sanderson, and he asked him to think about it and see what he thought about it. And Brother Sanderson put that music he had written with that song, and it fit perfectly. Everything fit perfectly. Thus, that beautiful song was born. Brother Sanderson wrote the music to it, and T.O. Chisholm wrote the words to it. Now, how can you explain that? Brother Sanderson, on that very night, couldn't concentrate on his sermon, and he put that music down. At the same time, T.O. Chisholm couldn't sleep, and he got up and wrote that poem. And you put it together, and it fit perfectly. I don't know what you call that. I believe it was the providence of God. That song has encouraged many people who have been hurting, grieving. And when they've read the words or sung the words of that song, it has strengthened them and helped them. I believe it was the providence of God. How else could that work for the music and the words to fit perfectly like that? They were 700 miles apart, They didn't know what the other was doing, and when they got through, it fit perfectly. God cares, and His providence will bless us through those difficult days when we're hurting. Thank you for being here tonight.